is CNN Breaking News.
Welcome to our viewers here in the United States and around the world. I'm Wolf Blitzer in the Situation Room. We're following breaking news. CNN has just learned that federal investigators are now looking at records of communications between U.S. members of Congress and the pro-Trump mob that attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. That, according to a U.S. official briefed on the matter. Meanwhile, the Capitol is still on high alert this hour after a warning of a possible attack plot linked to QAnon conspiracy theorists that former President Trump would inexplicably return to the presidency today. And there's more breaking news. A marathon push to pass the COVID relief bill has now begun in the U.S. Senate, where Republicans are using delay tactics, including a move that requires the massive 600-page legislation be read aloud, a process expected to take perhaps 10 hours. First, let's get to the breaking news. CNN senior justice correspondent Evan Perez is working the story for us. Evan, you've done some major reporting. Did some members of Congress help the rioters in their attack on the Capitol?
Well, Wolf, that is one of the things that investigators are trying to figure out. This is what they have now is devices that have been seized from some of the suspected rioters, the accused rioters, the insurrectionists, and there are indications that some of them were in touch with members of Congress in the days around January 6th. Now, what they have is communications between some of the rioters themselves talking about being in touch with members of Congress, as well as some of those communications or some of the data that indicates that they were in touch. Now, we don't know what those communications are, what was said, whether the members of Congress were in any way involved in the plotting or encouragement of the riot. But what we know is that this is something, obviously, that's very interesting to investigators, and they're going to have to try to figure this out. At this point, there's no indication that any members of Congress are actually under investigation. For that to happen, investigators would have to have some kind of probable cause. They'd have to be able to get a warrant to look at some of the content of the communications to try to figure that out, Wolf.
Is this a new phase in the entire investigation? It's now 2 months.
Yeah, it is. And this is, frankly, one of the things that Michael Sherwin, the acting U.S. attorney in Washington, outlined for us just over a month ago in describing the phases of this investigation. There were more than 300 people have now been arrested, or rather charged, with crimes related to January 6th. And one of the things they told us that they were going to do was they're going to move to a more complicated, more delicate part of the investigation, which is to try to look at funding, to look at any coordination, to look at, frankly, any political figures, and even President Trump and the people who spoke at the rally that preceded the insurrection, whether any of them have any criminal liability with regard to the incitement. Again, this is a sprawling investigation. Wolf, you know this is going to take months for investigators to figure out. But right now, certainly the question of whether members of Congress in any of their communications, whether they crossed the line, is going to be something the FBI and prosecutors are going to have to figure out.
Because I know that there was some suspicion that some of these rioters had been to Congress in the days leading up to the January 6th insurrection, actually getting tours of the complex. Is that right?
Right, exactly. And Democratic members of Congress have made those accusations, and the FBI has the video, surveillance video from the U.S. Capitol that shows what that could be. Again, none of that has been established. We don't know of any public anything any public information that indicates that actually occurred. We also know, Wolf, that some of the communications that investigators have, you have some of these rioters claiming that they acted as security for some of the lawmakers who attended rallies either the day before or the day of the insurrection. Again, all of that is frankly just smoke. As one official who I talked to said, this is something that they have to delve in deeper to figure out.
All right, very significant reporting, Evan. Thank you very much. Let's go up to Capitol Hill right now. Our senior national security correspondent, Alex Marquardt, is joining us. Alex, I know there's a lot of concern of a possible attack. It's been very high today, that concern. What's going on right now, especially since the House of Representatives decided they were not going to be in session?
That's right, Wolf. These security forces on high alert today because there had been intelligence this week indicating a chatter of a possible attack against the Capitol today on March 4th. This massive security presence has been out here since after the insurrection on January 6th, and they remain because the threat remains. This is the fencing that we've been showing you. 8 foot high with razor wire on top. Behind that, you have the National Guard that is on high alert. They are armed. Many of them have rifles. I was just speaking to some of these gentlemen. They're from Michigan. Then over here, Wolf, you can see these 2 armored trucks that are blocking the way. This is Constitution Avenue on the western side of the Capitol. Now, March 4th, Wolf, was also the day that QAnon conspiracy theorists believed that President Trump would reemerge and get sworn back in. Of course, that has not happened. But a major indication that this threat remains is that today we learned about a request that would keep the National Guard here for another 2 months. Just shy of 2 months since the insurrection, the Capitol is still a fortress and on high alert. Fears of attacks renewed today, fueled by a QAnon conspiracy theory that on March 4th, former President Donald Trump would reemerge and be sworn in again as president. Of course, that didn't happen. Thankfully, nor did any violence. But the concern was enough to shut down activity in the House of Representatives.
It was that serious and then enough to cancel votes. So I think there's some intelligence out there that said this could potentially be real. And look, I mean, this is going to be the new reality here for a little while.
Capitol Police said this week they obtained intelligence that shows a possible plot to breach the Capitol by an identified militia group, and that significant security upgrades were made. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security warned of growing chatter among extremists, including the 3%ers who support Trump and whose members, federal prosecutors say, were at the Capitol on January 6th.
I think President Trump has a responsibility to tell them to stand down. This threat is credible, and it's real.
Instead, today Trump did the opposite, declaring in a statement that the Georgia election was rigged, repeating a patently false assertion that likely helped fuel the insurrection. Today, Capitol Police asked that the National Guard extend their duty at the Capitol by 2 months. It was supposed to end next week. The request comes as the former General Russell Honore, who was put in charge of the security review following the insurrection, recommended adding 1,000 officers to the Capitol's force, as well as installing retractable fencing around the complex. The draft recommendations include adding officers in regional offices to protect lawmakers in their home districts. The added cost estimated to be around $100 million.
We have to have what we need when we need it and in the numbers that we need it.
The fallout from January 6th is far from over. Around 300 people have been arrested and charged, including the so-called QAnon shaman, Jacob Chansley, who broke into the Senate chamber and left a note for Mike Pence. He spoke with CBS.
I regret entering that building with every fiber of my being.
But you don't regret the loyalty to Donald Trump?
No.
Alex, I want you to stand by. I also want to bring in our chief political correspondent, Dana Bash, our former FBI Director, Andrew McCabe. He's our senior law enforcement analyst. He's also the author of the book, The Threat, How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump. Andrew, let me get your reaction, first of all, to the disturbing reporting we heard from Evan Perez right at the top of the hour that federal investigators have some data showing contact between various lawmakers and the rioters around the January 6th attack. So what kind of questions does that raise?
So, Wolf, this is classic FBI enterprise investigation technique. So what you saw in the first rounds of arrests, several hundred people being arrested for mere presence in the Capitol, that's a very logical place to start. But as they get deeper and deeper into that crowd of rioters, what the FBI is looking for is evidence of association between rioters. So they're looking at phone records. They're looking at the text records on rioters' cell phones and smartphones to see which folks may have been working with each other and planning. And it sounds like during the course of that work, they came across indicators of contact between some of the rioters and some members of Congress. That's going to likely be phone contacts or potentially even text messages, and also contact between rioters talking about referring to members of Congress. So this is very concerning. The one thing we can be sure of is the FBI is not going to let this go. You heard Chris Wray pledge that in front of Congress just a few days ago.
We certainly did. The FBI director. You know, Dana, we don't know if any members of Congress wittingly or unwittingly actually helped the mob, but at least politically there's been some alignment with the conspiracy theories that led to this attack, right?
And they continue to have alignment. I mean, you heard some, Louis Gohmert, for example, still spreading the big lie. The former president of the United States still, instead of heeding the call from one of the top Republicans in the House on Homeland Security and National Security, Michael McCaul, to our colleague Jake Tapper, saying, please, former President Trump, go out there and say, this day, March 4th, is not a day that I will be inaugurated. Please, understand that you shouldn't even think about any kind of attack, as law enforcement were warning about today. Instead, he put out a statement, angry at the Wall Street Journal because they wrote something about Georgia and the election results and blaming the former president for the 2 losses for the Republicans there, and double down on the big lie as part of that. So, yeah, I mean, there is you don't necessarily have to have the text messages that Andy was talking about or the phone calls to understand that there is real communication in the eyes of so many of these insurrectionists.
Yeah, and Dana, you're absolutely right in that statement that Trump put out today, of all days, when there's so much heightened concern about a possible additional attack on the Capitol. He's once again speaking about a, quote, rigged election. He's reigniting that fear to his supporters out there. It's very, very dangerous. Alex, you're there on the scene. I was driving around the U.S. Capitol complex earlier in the day, and clearly not only the police but the military, they're out on force. They're heavily armed. They've got protection. As you point out, they've got those huge trucks to prevent any vehicles from trying to get through those fences. And there are still about 5,000 National Guard troops on the scene?
Yeah, Wolf, the National Guard presence had been extended until the middle of March, until March 12th, because of the fears about today. And as we were just talking about, we have had this massive military and police presence out here since for weeks now, since after that insurrection, when the supporters of the president marched from the stage where they had heard him speak all the way down here to the Capitol. And then we had the horrific events of January 6th. And now we are starting to hear, as we were talking about in the piece, about what the very well-respected General Russell Honore is recommending in terms of a more permanent solution, because they understand that this threat, to some extent, is going to be permanent. So the key pillars of his recommendations that are still just proposals is that huge increase in police officers, as well as a retractable fence that would replace this fencing that has been out here for all these weeks. And then perhaps most importantly, Wolf, a quick reaction force that is made up of military police that the Capitol Police would be able to deploy quickly and immediately, in fact, as threats arise. Wolf?